and moral codes. And so I begin. Standing in the furnace of Reconstruction's injustice, African Americans clung to the same promises of their enslaved forebears. Though nominally free, African Americans remained under the harsh conditions of American racism. With the constant fear of lynchings coupled with their inability to obtain gainful employment, African Americans of the South were determined to relocate to a land where white supremacy was not fatal. Hence, the exodusters of the westward migration traveled by wagon, and some even walked towards the unsettled Indian territory of what they would consider Kansas, Mississippi, and Oklahoma, their promised land. Toni Morrison depicts this exodus in her 1997 work, Paradise, chronicling the migration to and the manufacturing of this New Eden. Chronicling the narrative history of Haven, the all-black town from whence many of the citizens of the main black town in the narrative, Ruby, hail, Paradise articulates the movement of black town exodus through the oral tradition shared within the Morgan family. Zachariah Morgan, who is the founder of Haven and the constructor of the oven and its words, would share the tales of, quote, their way west of the unassigned lands, end quote, to foster within his boys the pride that comes along with outliving the journey and starting the life one dreams. This vernacularization of the biblical Exodus narrative articulates the liberatory belief African Americans held that the same God who filled the Egyptian water supply with blood, the same God who destroyed the Egyptian crops with locusts, and the same God who killed the Egyptian firstborn children would once again partner with humanity to perform the same persuasive justice for them. For African Americans, the Exodus narrative was not a story, it was a plan of action. And thus, quote, whether as slaves absconding from plantations, terrorized sharecroppers in flight from Jim Crow, or civil rights activists protesting discrimination and disenfranchisement, African Americans have spoken of escape from oppression, as an exodus, and their goal of a better life as a promised land, end quote. Morrison capitalizes on this exodus by contrasting a narrative that illustrates humanity's attempt at preserving an oftentimes painfully constructed earthly paradise. For this reason, my thesis deconstructs Morrison's replication and manipulation of scripture within her novel, Paradise. I identify the rebuilt communal kitchen known as the oven as a symbol for the King James Bible, a sacred authoritative text good for the determining of human interaction. It is the desire of this study to query the authoritarian hermeneutics applied to scripture, and specifically the oven, as a means to understand how interpretation influences the construction and subsequent implementation of a given community's interpretation and influences on the ethics and morality of that community. So reading either beware the furrow of his brow or be the furrow of his brow, this illegible sign located on the lip of the oven, and the subsequent behavior of the Rubians based on their assertion of this text is the focus of this thesis. Through a close reading of characters and plot progression, I evidence how the application of various hermeneutics for biblical interpretation possess the power to both construct and determine the theological teachings, moral maxims, and political practices acceptable within a given community. For example, while meeting at Calvary, the name of one of the local churches in Ruby, Stuart Morgan, who is the son of founder Zachariah Morgan, constructor of the oven and its words, asserts that, quote, if you, any one of you, ignore, change, take away, or add to the words in the mouth of that oven, I will blow your head off just like you was a hood-eyed snake, end quote. Now, this monologue is a vernacularization of Revelation 22:18, verses 18 through 19, which states, for I testify unto every man that heareth the words of the prophecy of this book, if any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book. And if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God will take away his part out of the book of life and out of the holy city and from the things which are written in this book. This verse, along with Morrison's rephrasing of this biblical text, supports the notion of the sign as having a sacred authoritarian nature. Because the Ruby grown folk revere the message of the sign so highly, they refuse to allow the younger generation to clarify or change it in any way. This is because if the sign is changed, then the behavior of the people would have to change, as the sign speaks to how the people of Ruby interact with both God and man. Due to the presence of such biblical typology within Toni Morrison, I seek to understand how interpretive communities project authoritarian hermeneutics onto sacred texts like the Bible. I will construct the ethical and moral codes that subsequent communities are then bound to follow. I will engage the study in a 4-part thesis. In the introduction, I will evidence and assert Toni Morrison as theologian, displaying her and her work as an example of Catherine Clay Bassard's sacred subjects. I will then begin my thesis argument by engaging a juxtaposition of factual history against Morrison's fictional representation of history in my first content chapter, which is entitled The Holy Oven, the King James Version of the Bible as Social and Literary Authority. This chapter cites Norman Crockett's The Black Towns, Nell Irvine Painter's Exodusters, and William Lawrence Katz's The Black West, a documentary and pictorial history of the African-American role in the westward expansion of the United States. This is to evidence a brief history of the westward migration and the presence of the King James Bible during this post-Reconstruction Exodus movement. This chapter chronicles this history to show how the Bible served as a sacred authoritative text in both the historical black towns as well as within Morrison's fictional black towns, Haven and Ruby. Dedicated to understanding the interpretation and implementation of Scripture, my second content chapter, entitled Havenly Hermeneutics versus Ruby Righteousness, the interpretation and implementation of Scripture, identifies Ruby as an interpretive community and looks at the ways in which both the hermeneutic of suspicion as well as Dolores S. Williams' hermeneutic of identification ascertainment are deployed within Morrison's narrative. Finally, I end with my conclusion chapter entitled Revelation. As this is a project that engages with the replication and manipulation of Scripture, I felt it only appropriate to entitle my 4th part after the final book of the Bible that deals with prophecy. It is in this conclusion that I reassert my argument while placing it within a contemporary and cultural context, suggesting that just as the interpretation of sacred text affects the previously discussed societies of both the historical past and fictional past, such interpretation also impacts both our historical and fictional present and future. In closing, I leave you with this quote taken out of Morrison's text, Paradise. She says, "Whether they be the first or the last, representing the oldest black families or the newest, the best of the tradition or the most pathetic, they had ended up betraying it all. They think they have outfoxed the white man when in fact they imitate him. They think they are protecting their wives and children when in fact they are maiming them. And when the maimed children ask for help, they look elsewhere for the cause. Born out of an old hatred, one that began when one kind of black man scorned another kind, and that kind took the hatred to another level. Their selfishness had trashed 200 years of suffering and triumph in a moment of such pomposity and error and callousness, it froze the mind. How exquisitely human was the wish for permanent happiness, and how thin human imagination became trying to achieve it." Thank you for your time.
Give me 1 second.
That's your sister.